An ecosystem is a very complex entity with many interactive components. It can be defined as a system of complex interactions of populations between themselves and with their environment, or as a joint functioning and interaction of these two compartments, population and environment, in a functional unit of variable size. Marine and terrestrial ecosystems differ in fundamental ways. Gradients in turbulence, light pressure, and nutrients uniquely drive fundamental characteristics of organisms and ecosystems in the ocean. Marine ecosystems are often more technically difficult and costly to explore than terrestrial equivalents, which explain the low number of shorter scientific studies of marine ecosystems. Overall, many terrestrial species have recently moved on a global average, 17 kilometers poleward and 11 meters up in altitude per decade, which corresponds to predicted range shifts due to warming and is 2 to 3 times faster than previous estimates with high confidence in detection. Changes in temperature of ocean systems have generally been less than those of terrestrial ecosystems over the last 4 decades. The horizontal spatial gradient of temperature change is generally much higher in terrestrial ecosystems than in marine ecosystems. Species have generally needed to move much shorter distances in terrestrial ecosystems to stay within their preferred climates, due to the influence of the topography such as mountain ranges. Also, many marine species can potentially exploit strong vertical thermal gradients to attenuate the needs for range shifts in response to warming. Biological processes influencing phenological shifts may also differ substantially between systems. The cumulative impacts of climate change drivers underlie alterations of species interactions and ecosystem structures and functioning, including changes in trophodynamics and philosophical and chemical characteristics of habitats. These effects combine with more different effects, such as shifts in stratification and productivity, expanding oxygen minimum zones, and the changing composition and biomass of food. Studies of marine animals on their life stages show a high diversity and variability of processes affected by ocean acidification. Reflect physiological performance. In some species, growth may be stimulated by OA, in others depressed or unaffected. The degree of CO2-induced acidosis and its compensation by ion exchange may shape sensitivity. Full exploitation of the ability to resist PCO2 increases depends on the ability on high quality of food and strictness of fitness. On the other hand, reduced calcification and weakened calcified structures were seen under elevated PCO2 in corals, echinoderm, mollusks, and larval crustaceans. In some adult crabs, lobsters, and shrimps, calcification rates increase further with rising PCO2. Energy costs in epithelia or calcification compartments may be enhanced by elevated PCO2, causing a stimulation of metabolism. In some cases, this may indicate imbalances in energy budget rather than increased CO2 resistance. For example, if costs are down-regulated in muscle or liver, enhanced calcification can then occur at the expense of growth. The density of water is a function of its own temperature. When water is warmer than 4 Celsius degrees, it gets less dense for each increment in degrees Celsius. This allows for thermal layering, where warmer water is stored on top of colder water, defined as thermal stratification. Thermal stratification in many regions has reduced ocean ventilation and mixing depth. As this reduces the availability of inorganic nutrients, it can reduce primary productivity in surface layers. However, trends in primary production from different observational methods disagree. Coastal upwelling has increased in some regions, boosting productivity and enhancing fisheries output. Increases in productivity also occur with warming and sea ice loss at high latitude. Poleward shifts in the distribution of zooplankton, fish, seabirds, and benthic invertebrates related to climate change have been detected in the Northeast Atlantic. Some studies have found changes in the abundance of fish species that are consistent with regional warming, with differences in response between species.
Another system that is affected and involved in climate change is coastal systems and low-lying areas. The coast can be seen as a system in order to help understanding the processes and interactions involved. In theory, the inputs, processes, and outputs work together to create coastal equilibrium. According to the fifth assessment report of IPCC, sea surface temperatures have increased significantly during the past 30 years, along more than 70% of the world's coastlines. Seawater pH spans large range and exhibit higher variability near coastlines, and anthropogenic ocean acidifications can be enhanced or reduced by coastal chemical processes. Throughout the world, the rate of shoreline erosion is increasing. While processes related to climate change can be expected to engage global erosion, there are multiple drivers involved in shoreline erosion that are unrelated to climate change, including longshore sediment transport, the diversion of sediments by dams and subsidence due to resource extraction, mining, and coastal engineering and development. Most coastal reefs, seagrass beds, mangroves, rocky reefs, and sea shells had undergone substantial change over the course of the last century. In the case of coral reefs, these have been degraded due both to local anthropogenic factors such as fishing, land use changes, and pollution, and to ocean warming. Another fact is that over the past 30 years, mass coral bleaching has been detected on all coasts, and warming is a major cause. Other causes about the rocky shore species that globally the range of these species has shifted up to 50 kilometers per decade, much faster than most recorded shifts of terrestrial species. With these cases, we can see that ocean warming has contributed to observed range shifts in vegetated coastal habitats such as coastal wetlands, mangrove forests, and seagrass meadows. A possible case of study of the behavior of some coastal ecosystems is the polywater expansion of mangrove forest, consistent with expected behavior on the climate change, has been observed in the Gulf of Mexico and New Zealand. Recent global and regional studies have found increases in extreme sea levels consistent with mean sea level trends. Increases in saltwater intrusion and flooding have been observed in low-lying agricultural areas of deltaic regions and small islands. However, the contribution of climate change, this is not clear. In summary, there is high confidence. This means high agreement and robust evidence in the detection of the impact of climate change on the abundance and distribution of a range of coastal species, and medium confidence. This means that has a medium agreement and medium evidence that climate change has played a major role in many cases. In the part of coastal settlements and infrastructure, we have that recent global and regional studies have found increases in extreme sea levels, consistent with mean sea level trends, indicated that the increasing frequency of extreme water levels affecting coastal infrastructure so far is related to rising mean sea level rather than to the changes in the behavior of severe storms. Changes are predicted to have impacts on marine organisms and ecosystems. However, the detection of these predict changes and the assessment of the role of climate change in them are complicated by the influence of long-term variability.
Now let's talk about something related to oceans, water. The regional water balance is the net result of gains, precipitation, ice and snow melt, river inflow and groundwater recharge, and losses, evapotranspiration, water use at river outflow, and groundwater discharge of water. Impacts of climate change include reduced availability of fresh water for use, one of the variables defining drought or excess waters, floods. On the global scale, human influence has contributed to large-scale changes in precipitation patterns over land and, since the mid-20th century, in extreme precipitations. More locations worldwide have experienced an increase than a decrease in heavy rainfall events, yet with significant regional and seasonal variations. Changing river flow is a direct indicator of a changing regional water balance. Globally, about one-third of the top 200 rivers ranked by river flow show statistically significant trends during 1948 to 2004, with more rivers having reduced flow 45 than rivers with increased flow. Erosion and landsliding typically increase in phase with deglaciation in mountain areas, and there is emerging evidence for this to occur during contemporary deglaciation. In some cases, climate change has had a major role in influencing frequency and magnitude of alpine shallow landslides and debris flows by altering sediment yield, for example, from rockfall or disintegration of rock glaciers. Glacier shrinkage, permafrost degradation, and high-temperature events have contributed to many high mountain rock slope failures since the 1990s. Cascading processes of permafrost and ice-related landslides impacting lakes and downstream areas have been observed in many high mountain regions, causing major damages and risk reduction measures, with climate change exerting a major role. For landslides types other than the above, there is no clear evidence that their frequency or magnitude has changed over the past decades. In general, detection of changes in the occurrence of landslides is complicated by incomplete inventories, both in time and space, and inconsistency in terminology. Physical understanding suggests that climate change has a major role in changes of snow avalanche activity, but no such changes have been reported so far, except for the French Alps. Many terrestrial ecosystems are now net sinks for carbon over much of the northern hemisphere and also in parts of the southern hemisphere. This is shown, for example, by inference from atmospheric chemistry, but also by direct observations of increased tree growth in many regions, including Europe, the USA, tropical Africa, and the Amazon. During the decade 2000 to 2009, global land net primary productivity was approximately 5% above the pre-industrial level, contributing to a net carbon sink on land of 2.6 more or less 1.2 pgc year 1, despite ongoing deforestation. Forests have increased in biomass for several decades in Europe and the USA. These trends are in part due to nitrogen deposition, afforestation, and altered land management, which makes direct attribution of the increase to climate change difficult. The degree to which rising atmospheric CO2 concentrations contribute to this trend remains a particularly important source of uncertainty. Each species responds differently to a changing environment. Therefore, the composition of species, genotypes, communities, and even ecosystems varies in different ways from place to place in response to climate change. The consequences are changing ranges of species, changing composition of the local species pool, invasions, mortality, and ultimately extinctions. For different species and species groups, detected range shifts vary, and so do the confidence of detection and the degree of attribution to climate change. Overall, many terrestrial species have recently moved, on a global average, 17 kilometers poleward and 11 kilometers up in altitude per decade, which corresponds to predicted range shifts due to warming and is 2 to 3 times faster than previous estimates with high confidence in detection. Changes in abundance, as measured by changes in the population size of individual species or shifts in the community structure within extincting range limits, have occurred in response to recent global warming, but owing to co-founders, confidence in a major role of climate change is often low. Across the world, species extinctions are at or above the highest rates of species extinction in the fossil record. However, only a small fraction of observed species extinctions have been attributed to climate change. Most have been ascribed to non-climatic factors such as invasive species, overexploitation, or habitat loss. For those species where climate change has been invoked as a causal factor in extinction, such as for the case of Central American amphibians. There is low agreement among investigators concerning the importance of climate variation in driving extinction, and even less agreement that extinctions were caused by climate change. Confidence in the suggested attribution of extinctions across all species to climate change is very low.
The ocean temperatures have increased by around 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade since 1970. This rise of temperature has been occurring in the upper 75 meters and approximately 0.015 degrees Celsius per decade at 700 meters. It is probable that this increase has a substantial contribution from anthropogenic forcing. The ocean has reduced the average pH of seawater by about 0.1 pH units over the past century due to the increased flux of CO2 from the atmosphere. The greatest reduction have been occurring at high latitudes, due to the increases in the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases as a result of human activity. Changes are predicted to have impacts on marine organisms and ecosystems. However, the detection of these predict changes and the assessment of the role of climate change in them are complicated by the influence of long-term variability. Studies of marine animals and their life stages show a high diversity and variability of processes affected by the ocean acidification, reflect physiological performance. In some species, growth may be stimulated by OA, in others depressed or unaffected. The degree of CO2-induced acidosis and its compensation by ion exchange may shape sensitivity. Full exploitation of the ability to resist PCO2 increases depends on the availability and high quality of food and the strengthening of fitness. Reduced calcification and weakened calcified structures were seen under elevated PCO2 in corals, echinoderm mollusks, and larval crustaceans. Energy cost in epithelia or calcification compartments may be enhanced by the elevated PCO2, causing a stimulation or metabolism in some cases. This may indicate imbalance in energy budget rather than increased CO2 resistance.